As one of the 20 largest economies in the world, Australia has become one of Vietnam's very potential export and investment markets. In particular, Vietnam and Australia are members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as the CPTPP. This is a favorable condition to promote trade and investment. However, right now, Vietnam's total export turnover to Australia accounts for only 1.84% of the country's total exports, a relatively small rate compared to a rather large market like Australia. This week's Bizline tries to find out why Vietnam's exports to Australia are still limited and how Vietnamese businesses can take advantage of the CPTPP to gain better access to the Australian market. But first, let's take a look at the following clip to have an overview of the current trade relation between Vietnam and Australia. We have invited to our studio today Mr. Raymond Mallon, economist and advisor of the Australia-Vietnam Economic Reform Program. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting.
Now, first of all, we have mentioned a few figures relating to exports and investment from Vietnam to Australia. So what are your thoughts on the statistic mentioned in the clip?
I think they're a good measure of reality. I think that sets the picture. What it doesn't capture probably is some of the other linkages between Australia and Vietnam. Some of the person-to-person linkages. If you look at Australia, the number of Vietnamese going to study in Australia is about equal to the US, and on a per capita basis that makes Australia very large. There's also a lot of cooperation between institutions. We look at the cooperation between the Productivity Commission, the Australian Competition and Consumer Council, and ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, but also other universities. There's a lot of person-to-person linkages that help boost Vietnam's economic productivity and will promote Vietnam's long-term competitiveness. So I think that's the sort of thing that you don't capture in this data. I think also Australia and Vietnam have worked very closely together in negotiating some of these regional agreements, including CPTP and RCEP, and I think that's another positive step. And the other area of involvement between Australia and Vietnam is through the ODA program. In the past, that was significant, and now Australia is still one of the largest bilateral providers of ODA. So there are some other areas. When you look at why trade itself and investment is limited, although Australia is the 20th largest economy in the world, or in the top 20, it's a very small population compared with the other countries mentioned. You know, China has 1,400 million people. US has 325 million. I think Vietnam's 96. Australia's only 25 million people. So actually, on a per capita basis, you're exporting more to Australia than you are to the US or to China. So there will always be a limit because of the small scale in terms of exports, and particularly for consumer products, where there's only so much that consumers can eat, of how much Vietnam will be able to export to Australia.
What can you say about the figures on both export, import, and also on investment?
Well, I think that's probably mostly realistic. I mean, you could make an argument that China might be even a bit higher than reported because there's a lot of informal cross-border trade. Some exports to Australia are transshipped through other countries, so maybe it's a slight underestimate. But I think it's a good measure of reality. When foreign direct investment laws were first liberalised, the amount of foreign investment coming, Australia was one of the largest in the early stages. Telstra, for instance, when it came in, was one of the first major foreign investors, which transformed telecommunications. But Australia is small. A lot of the foreign investment coming in to Vietnam is in manufacturing and also in real estate. Australia doesn't have a big manufacturing sector. It's predominantly a resource economy and service sector economy. You know, it's things like agriculture and mining, plus services, health, education, and commercial services. So the areas that Vietnam's been attracting all its foreign direct investment in is not one of the major strengths of the Australian economy.
Okay. Now, I know that you've mentioned a little bit about why the goods export to Australia is still limited, but can you elaborate on this? Why is good exports from Vietnam to Australia is still limited?
I think the first thing is what I mentioned about the size of the market. You know, that will always limit it. Secondly, some of the areas that Vietnam has a comparative advantage in trading in are areas that Australia is relatively strong in too. Both Australia and Vietnam have reputations for exporting agriculture commodity, food products in particular, processed food, and quite high quality in most cases. So there's some area, to some extent, in that agricultural area, which particularly in the past was a major part of Vietnam's exports. Australia's got a comparative advantage. You know, there are some niche markets where Vietnam is competing in Australia and some of the tropical fruits. Australia grows tropical fruits also, but at different times of the year, so the seasonality works well. I think there's great potential to continue that, and then you can see other food products such as processed, you know, instant noodles, condiments. You're seeing Vietnamese fish sauce, soy sauce, all that appearing in Australia, but probably limited. I think as you move up the value chain into you know, higher value manufacturing, I think there's going to be increased opportunity. At the moment, by far the dominant trading partner with Australia is China. They're supplying most of our manufactured goods at the moment. This provides a great opportunity as Vietnam gets its economies of scale to take over some of that market share from Vietnam. The other problem that Vietnam will face in agriculture, for instance, is Australia has some of the tightest SBS and health standards in the world. Some countries would argue that they are technical, you know, they're a form of protection, but they are. They're tough. They're hard to get around, and to get around them, you've got to have a certain scale to make it worthwhile to comply with those Australian standards. That's an important factor, and I think what will be important in the future is in Vietnam, as the logistics, as the trade support services develop, and providing support for agriculture and for other businesses, that will help overcome some of those barriers. Those specialised agencies will know what's required to meet Australian standards, and farmers, for instance, in agriculture will need to be organised together to ensure there's enough scale, consistency of quality, not just quality that's there, but getting the consistency of quality and standards to meet the needs of the Australian market. I think all those sorts of things. The other problem is also for small scale is just getting on top of all the other requirements which apply to all countries, things like rules of origins, certifying where the products come from. That's been cumbersome, and when there's been a whole lot of bilateral agreements, all with their own rules, it makes it very hard for small businesses to be able to be on top of all those regulations. One of the great advantages of doing these regional cooperation agreements is that the aim is to harmonise things like rules of origins and certificates of origin. And if you only have to know one set of rules for all countries and have the same procedures, that'll make it much easier for smaller enterprises to have a chance of exporting.
What are Vietnam's key exports to Australia, and how potential it is for further push?
The main areas of exports include some of the agricultural commodities, or really not commodities, the high value agricultural products that I mentioned before, the tropical, the horticultural, and plus some processed foods. That seems to be, and then also in manufacturing, electronics, some metal products, and phones and garments. They'd probably be the main areas, and some in the services sector. And I think the services sector particularly is one area where there's going to be opportunities in the future. One of the big differences between the new style of regional economic cooperation agreement is that they have a stronger focus on services and a stronger focus on harmonising rules, which will facilitate much more movement, much more cross-border sharing of services or trade in services, and they're very important for developing the regional production network. So I think that's something you'll see a lot more of in the future.
In terms of agriculture, what are the main commodities that you think have a lot of potential for exports? I believe that we have mangoes that have been exported to Australia, and I think dragon fruit. What else can you say about these type of commodities, and what are other products that we can push for export?
I think all the high value horticultural products, so that will include mangoes, dragon fruit, lychees, and plus seafood. Again, we export seafood, but there's still areas where trade is possible. So I think all those areas in agriculture are going to be important, but again, they're areas where quality, and not just quality, but consistency of quality are very, very important. And one of the other problems in Australia, there's a limited number of buyers. We have 2 major supermarkets, or a bit more competition coming in now, but it's limited. So you've got to build a reputation, you've got to have a track record there. And one of the things they're really looking for is the consistency in quality, but also consistency in the availability of supply. They don't want to turn on and turn off. So to achieve that, that requires cooperation between the people who are going to buy it in the market with another institution in Vietnam who can help ensure that the farmers coordinate in terms of production to see that they're planting similar varieties, harvesting at similar times, and also making sure the use of chemicals or pesticides are in conformity with Australian requirements. And then also very important is traceability, so that they'll be able to go back, and if there are problems with products, you can see exactly where they come from, so that action can be taken to ensure the quality in the future.
Now, with commitments in CPTPP and other existing free trade agreement between Vietnam and Australia, what opportunities will it bring to enterprises and investors from both sides?
Well, I think one of the problems in the past is that Vietnam's struggle with the complexity of rules, and one of the new agreements is aiming to reduce the complexity, trying to make sure that all countries move towards harmonised rules as one thing, like the rules of origin, the certificates of origin, these sorts of things, but also harmonisation of other things such as competition policy, labour standards, things like intellectual property protection, rules in terms of competitive neutrality, the role of SOEs. So if all the countries who are trading among each other have similar rules, it will make it easier to ensure compliance. So I think this is going to be very important. This is going to be more important. In the past, under the old free trade agreement, was all about minimising tariffs, and reducing tariffs. One of the things Australia has is some of the lowest tariffs in the world. So the benefits from any of these agreements in terms of accessing Australian market from tariffs is very limited, because they were already very low. What is there will be reduced, but it's probably these other changes that will be much more important for Vietnam.
But what potential would it bring to investors and enterprises from both sides?
Well, one of the things of having the harmonised rules and making sure and having investors more confident that their property rights will be protected when they invest in the other country is that there will be more investment coming in here into regional production networks. Hopefully in the higher end of the regional production networks, it'll help Vietnam move up the value chain. I think that's where the potential is. Then associated with those production networks is services sector development. A lot of the cross-border production networks are not just about manufacturing, it's having the logistics services, the packaging, the marketing that goes with that. So I think they're all areas of great potential. And then in other services such as education, health, business services, I mentioned right at the beginning about the large numbers of Vietnamese studying in Australia. For many Vietnamese, it would make more sense if there was more investment in education in Vietnam to reduce the cost of sending so many people overseas for study. So hopefully there will be more foreign investment in universities, and that will reduce the need to send so many people overseas.
Okay. What do you think about the commitments in CPTPP between Vietnam and Australia? Is it higher than compared to other regional countries such as ASEAN or like in New Zealand?
Between Australia and I think the CPTPP takes...
I mean commitment, Vietnam's commitment to CPTPP, is it higher than compared to New Zealand, Australia and...
Yes.
We are making comparison between CPTPP and AANZ.
Yeah.
So is the commitment between Vietnam and Australia in terms of CPTPP is higher than compared to existing commitments of AANZ between Australia, New Zealand and ASEAN?
Yes, it's a bit broader, not so much broader, but it does cover a wider range of areas, and it has much more focus on boosting economic cooperation. I think by having, again, the bigger group of countries in there will make it more attractive as well. ANZPTA was relatively small. Basically, it was ASEAN plus Australia and New Zealand, so there's not a big incentive for producers to get on top of the rules and the procedures for ANZPTA. It's a really relatively small market. Now you've got a CPTP, it's much bigger focus. So I think that's what's much more attractive about that grouping. Moving towards harmonisation of such a big market is very, very important. I think also the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement is going to be very important for similar reasons. So it's a much bigger scale, therefore I think there's going to be many more opportunities. I think one of the other things it does, both those agreements, is it provides an opportunity to diversify your sources of investment. Most of the investment at the moment, foreign investment coming into Vietnam, has been from Asia, and it's been fantastic for Vietnam in terms of introducing technology. But in terms of minimising risk, it's probably good to have diversified sources of foreign investment. And I think one of the big outcomes of the two agreements is that you're going to see a greater diversification, more foreign investment coming from some of the other OECD countries from Australia, but also from Europe, from Canada, etc. And I think that's good for reducing risk and sustainability of Vietnam's economic development.
Okay. Now, what should be done to better utilise such opportunities from CPTPP?
Well, I think one is knowing about it, and that's not just having a website with the information. That doesn't work. So I think part of what's important is, I think hopefully there will be an awareness of the potential benefits. But also important is for Vietnam to continue its reform efforts. Things like building market economic institutions, freeing the barriers for private sector development. And one of the problems is that if you have a whole lot of very small private sector, very hard for them to have the scale to access international markets. Sometimes they do. So as you see the domestic private corporate sector develop, that will also provide new opportunities. So Vietnam should continue in many of the same reform areas. I think that will be very important. And then particularly it's going to be areas like support services, trade support services, logistics, all these sorts of things are going to be critical. It's going to be the service companies who really are on top of, the support services companies that are really going to be on top of what opportunities are available in other countries. So they can help make the networks. It's not just about doing promotion and saying you've got this product. It's about building your networks with the other countries. The cross-border production networks are an important way of marketing and accessing new markets. So all these sorts of things are going to be important.
How can we take advantage of the tariff preferences?
In the case of Australia, the tariff preferences are going to be probably limited because Australian tariff rates were relatively low. The key to getting access to them, though, is being able to comply with rules of origin. In the case of CPTP, for instance, if you want to get the most out of the potential for exporting garments, because at the moment you import a lot of your inputs for making garments from China, under the rules of origin, they won't get the benefits of the tariff reductions because they don't meet the rules of origin. To meet the rules of origin, the inputs that you're using into the products you're manufacturing for export have to be made by one of the other CPTP countries. So to get the most out of it, you would hope that more of the inputs that you're using to make garments, for instance, are made here. It might mean that you're making more yarn here, more materials. Maybe that means you import more cotton or wool from Australia, then manufacture. Then you get the full the tariff preferences that are available. It potentially will reduce the amount of imports you're coming from China because they won't be covered by the rules of origin. You won't get the tariff preferences if you're using inputs from China.
In your opinion, what are the biggest challenges for Vietnam's agro-produce to increase its presence in Australia?
Size of the market's going to be a problem. The fact that Australia is also an agricultural producer that limits the opportunities, and complying with Australia's strict SPS and safety standards. That's a real challenge. But I think there will be niche markets, and I think the key is making sure that Vietnam has a reputation for instance, in horticulture, for making some of the best fruit in the world, but it's getting the consistency in terms of the quality, not just quality, size, colour, all that sort of thing matters. So I think these are the sorts of challenges in the agriculture area. And then getting the scale, and to get the scale, it's a matter of local institutions working with farmers, helping organise farmers so that that they meet the quality standards, that you organise in terms of being able to do traceability if there are problems. I think these are the areas where you're going to have to work on.
Okay. What about the other challenges that Vietnamese firms face? I mean, in terms of information regarding CPTPP, many Vietnamese enterprises still have very limited knowledge about it,
yes.
Or also competitive pressure from other countries also exporting to Australia. So what can you say about these other challenges?
The usual solution is to say, well, get the information out, do websites. Most people don't read it. It's not a great way. So in the end, the reality is a lot of the people will get information by their service providers, by their trade specialist companies, logistics companies, whatever. They'll be getting information that way. They'll learn. They'll also learn from each other. As someone else starts engaging in trading, they'll see what they're doing. They'll learn from that experience. The other way is through the regional production networks or other linkages with established exporters. So you would like to see more and more of the foreign investors building links with domestic companies, domestic firms, and maybe exporting that way. So I think you take a multi-pronged approach. The easy answer is not the right answer in this case of just getting the information. Maybe that's useful, but in the end, it's all about production networks, building contacts in the other countries. And for many small-scale producers like farmers, small businesses, they won't have the scale economies to do that themselves. It'll be a matter of having the linkages with other firms, might be bigger Vietnamese firms, it might be foreign investment firms, or it could be through specialist firms providing support services.
Now, can you help explain some characteristic and tastes of the Australian consumers so Vietnamese enterprises have a better understanding to better cater to their demand?
I'm very poorly qualified for that question on two bases. I've lived in Vietnam longer than Australia, and secondly, I'm not a marketer. But I think it goes. At least what I know is that we're probably not that dissimilar. Australia is increasingly, particularly since I've left there, become a multicultural society. There's people from all around the world. I think people there like trying new things, experimenting with new products, and I think this provides an opportunity. But we do, Australia does have very strict quality control standards. They want not just the quality, that's not going to be a problem, but the consistency of the quality will be a problem. And again, with the limited number of buyers there, that's particularly important. How you build a reputation to access the market there, and then once you have that access, to maintain that reputation, I think are particularly important. But I don't think there's anything particularly unique to Australia that Vietnam will have a problem in terms of the products it supplies.
Well, looking from a macro point of view, what else should be done to further promote trade and investment from Vietnam to Australia?
I think what's being done in terms of the person-to-person linkages is a great start for the future, because that's how you build the networks, the contacts, and understand what each party is looking for. So I think the fact that there are so many Vietnamese who have studied in here coming back, you've built the networks in Australia. Now increasingly more Australian students are coming to spend part of their study time in Vietnam. There's the provision for work visits, exchanges between Australia and Vietnam. I think all these sorts of things can help. But fundamentally, it's all that Vietnam is doing in terms of its economic reform program to improve the regulatory environment for business. So this is what matters, and this is what's good for Vietnam, not just for exporting to Australia, but for everyone. And that's building competitive market economy, making sure there is competition between all players, whether it's the domestic private sector, foreign investors, or state sector. They've all got to be competing on the same basis. That's how you get innovation and productivity growth, make sure there's no barriers to the entry of new enterprises. When you have that, and you have the domestic private sector reaching a scale that will allow them to engage and to trade, I think these sorts of things matter. I think some of the other linkages, institutional ones between Australia, I think they can help. Where there's a lot of sharing experiences. The Australian Productivity Commission was critically important in Australia. We had a very over-regulated business sector that stifled the economy up until the 90s, and the Productivity Commission took a big role in the regulatory reform there that saw a major acceleration of productivity growth in Australia. So that sharing of information there is very important. In agriculture, there's a lot of sharing of information with the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research and their counterparts in Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta on tropical fruit, but in the north on other areas. I think these sorts of can help. They can help in getting that scale, the consistency and quality, help in setting up systems for traceability. All these sorts of things are things to continue to work on. Okay. I don't think there's anything so unique to the agreements themselves. It's a matter of continuing to sustain what the government is already doing and already making quite some progress in terms of simplifying the regulatory environment for business, simplifying the regulatory environment for trade, while making sure you continue to have the regulatory safeguards in place to ensure that the environment is managed well and consumer rights are protected, worker rights are protected. So getting that right, and there's no easy answer there. The other area that's coming up increasingly is getting the right regulatory framework for e-commerce. That's going to be a major growth area, and there's a temptation to over-regulate because you don't know what it is. Be very careful, I think, in that area. No country's got it right yet, so it's a learning exercise. But you don't want to stifle the growth of e-commerce. So I think the key then again is keeping the linkages with other countries, seeing what they're doing, seeing what the impact of their regulatory framework is on growth, and learning from that experience. Be prepared to change if you see the current regulatory environment is not encouraging and facilitating e-commerce, e-trade.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
In the coming time, Vietnamese enterprises need to study the content of the CPTPP, analyze and understand the requirements of the Australian market, and focus on unique agricultural products such as dragon fruit, mangoes, textile, computer, wooden furniture, and mobile phone parts. In order to set a strong foothold in the Australian market, Vietnamese enterprises must aim at a cleaner production in which product quality is always a top priority rather than output and price. And that wraps up this edition of BizLine. In the meantime, feel free to log on to vtv4.vtv.vn or install our mobile app VTV4 Go for more news and entertainment. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time.
Okay, thank you
so much. Please remain